Comment below where you're watching this from and what time it is right now. I read everyone.
My name is Eli Vance, and for 28 years I worked as a senior geotechnical maintenance inspector for the Gulf Coast Strategic Reserve, stationed down in Iberia Parish, Louisiana. If you aren't familiar with subterranean salt dome storage, it is one of the most isolated and dangerous industrial environments on Earth. 2,000 feet beneath the cypress swamps and tidal marshes lie massive, artificial caverns hollowed out of solid rock salt caverns, large enough to swallow the Empire State Building whole. Used to store millions of barrels of crude oil and pressurized brine under immense geological weight. My job wasn't sitting behind a desk or reading computer telemetry. I was one of the few licensed deep cavern technicians responsible for descending into dormant, unlit salt vaults to inspect structural bulkheads, check high-pressure casing seals, and ensure that the surrounding bedrock wasn't shifting. It was quiet, suffocating work. Down at 2,000 feet, the air is thick, bone-dry, and tastes heavily of ancient salt and machine grease. The temperature inside the salt dome stays at a constant 85 degrees year-round, and the acoustic echo is so severe that the drop of a single steel bolt against the floor can be heard half a mile away through the dark. When you spend 3 decades working beneath the marsh, you learn to respect the absolute silence of the earth. You learn that rock salt under 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure behaves like a slow liquid. It groans, it creaks, and it constantly seeks to close any hollow space carved into it by human hands. You get used to the strange trickery of subterranean acoustics, where the sound of your own heartbeat echoes back at you from a quarter mile away, sounding like footsteps following you through the dark. You convince yourself that if danger comes, it will come in the form of a methane gas pocket, a structural roof spall, or a high-pressure brine blowout. You never prepare yourself for something that doesn't belong in any geological textbook or safety protocol. Everything I am about to tell you took place during the late autumn of 1994, right around the second week of November. A series of low-frequency seismic anomalies had been picked up by our monitoring station on the surface, centered directly beneath Cavern 12. Cavern 12 was an old, abandoned brine extraction chamber that had been mined out in the late 1960s and sealed shut after a catastrophic water inflow disaster that killed 4 miners. It was supposed to be completely flooded with saturated salt brine, pressurized to 1,200 psi, and isolated from the rest of the facility by an 18-inch thick reinforced concrete bulkhead. That Tuesday morning, our surface automated telemetry registered a sudden, unexplained drop in Cavern 12's internal pressure. Millions of gallons of pressurized brine had vanished somewhere into the deep rock salt, and the automated monitoring sensors inside the vault had gone dead one by one. My supervisor at the surface office told me to take the 2-man inspection cage down the primary access shaft, check the structural integrity of the concrete bulkhead, and determine where the pressure leak was occurring before the entire dome destabilized. My partner for the dive was Marcus Albright, a 42-year-old veteran mechanic who had spent 20 years working the deep salt shafts of southern Louisiana. Marcus was a quiet, practical man who didn't care for ghost stories or tavern rumors. He was a master welder, knew every inch of the facility's steel infrastructure, and possessed a calm, methodical demeanor that made him the best man to have beside you when a hydraulic line burst or a hoist motor jammed deep underground. 14. We stepped into the narrow, open-sided steel inspection cage at 8 o'clock in the morning, hooked our safety harnesses to the center frame, and signaled the surface hoist operator to lower us down. The descent into the main vertical shaft took nearly 7 minutes. Through the heavy wire mesh of the cage, the yellow glare of our headlamps swept across the dark, glistening walls of pure white rock salt, glistening with condensation and old industrial grease. The air grew steadily hotter, thicker, and drier with every 100 feet we descended, until the cool air of the surface was nothing more than a distant memory. When the winch finally brought the cage to a smooth stop at the 2,000-foot level, we stepped out onto the damp, white salt floor of the main gallery. The silence hit us like a heavy wool blanket. The main gallery was 20 feet wide and 30 feet tall, an endless tunnel of glistening, crystalline salt that stretched away into the absolute darkness beyond the short reach of our halogen lamps. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling keystone 50 yards ahead, plinking into a shallow drainage ditch with a sound like a ticking clock. We walked 500 yards down the gallery, our heavy rubber-soled boots making a distinct times crunch, crunch, crunch times against the dry salt bed. We carried 2 3-cell halogen flashlights, a brass sampling hammer, a multi-gas monitor, and a heavy iron lining bar for checking loose masonry. The air was dead, hot, and stale, smelling faintly of old diesel exhaust and sulfur. At the end of the gallery sat the primary bulkhead of Cavern 12, a massive 18-inch wall of poured, steel-reinforced concrete set deep into the surrounding rock salt. As we approached the wall, Marcus raised his flashlight beam, and both of us stopped dead in our tracks. The massive concrete bulkhead wasn't cracked or leaking water. It had been breached from the inside out. A hole 6 feet wide and 8 feet high had been punched straight through the center of the 18-inch reinforced concrete. The heavy steel rebar rods bent and twisted outward like frayed pieces of wire. And there was no brine behind the wall. The millions of gallons of saturated salt water that should have filled the cavern behind the bulkhead were completely gone, leaving only a dark, vast void beyond the broken masonry. We stood in front of the jagged hole in the bulkhead, the beams of our halogen lamps cutting into the thick, warm mist that was venting out from the cavern beyond. The air coming through the breach was 90 degrees warm, thick with moisture, and carried a strange, sickly odor that made my throat tighten instantly. It wasn't the smell of crude oil or stagnant water. It smelled like raw copper, wet river silt, and stale, rotten lard that had been trapped underground for decades. Sniffs. "Where the hell did the brine go, Eli?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he shined his light into the vast, dark void behind the wall. "That's 5 million barrels of salt water. You don't lose that much volume unless the entire bottom of the dome fell out into the deep mantle." I stepped up to the edge of the breach, holding my brass sampling hammer in my right hand, and shined my flashlight beam through the broken concrete. The floor of Cavern 12 dropped off steeply into a massive, natural amphitheater of white rock salt, big enough to hold a naval fleet. Sitting 50 yards down the white slope, half buried in a thick bank of dry salt dust and old industrial debris, was a rusted 1960s diesel shuttle car, the vehicle left behind by the mining crew when the cavern flooded in 1968. The shuttle car wasn't rusted or decayed. Preserved by the dry salt air and decades of saturated brine, the yellow paint on its steel sides looked as bright as the day it was manufactured, and the thick rubber tires were still inflated. But as I swept my light across the open cab of the vehicle, my heart gave a heavy, sickening thud against my ribs. Sitting behind the steering wheel of the shuttle car was a human figure. It was dressed in the faded canvas coveralls and hard hat of a 1960s miner. But the body wasn't a skeleton, and it wasn't decayed. The flesh of his hands and face was solid, calcified white, completely encrusted in a smooth, thick layer of rock salt crystals that made him look like a statue carved out of marble. His jaw was hanging wide open, his empty eye sockets staring straight up toward the ceiling of the cavern. Coughs. "Eli," Marcus said, his hand grabbing my shoulder with a tight, nervous grip. "Look at the wall behind the shuttle car. That isn't a natural salt fissure. I raised my lamp toward the far wall of the cavern. Directly behind the abandoned shuttle car, a vertical fissure 10 feet wide had opened in the solid rock salt, a jagged black tier that stretched hundreds of feet downward into the unmapped bedrock below the dome. It hadn't been blasted with dynamite, and it hadn't been dissolved by fresh water. The pure white rock salt along the edges of the fissure looked as if it had been torn apart by hand, scratched, gouged, and shredded by something that possessed unimaginable physical force. Before I could answer, the two-way radio clipped to my shoulder strap let out a sharp, high-pitched burst of static that nearly deafened me. The signal wasn't coming from the surface office. It was a rhythmic, artificial crackle of sound, like a mechanical recording being played through an old copper speaker. Pant. Through the heavy static, a voice called out over the radio channel. It was low, clear, and spoke with the exact voice, accent, and inflection of Marcus's brother Tommy, who worked as the night hoist operator up in the surface building. "Marcus," the voice crackled through the speaker, its tone calm, pleasant, and entirely unhurried. "Marcus, is that you down in 12? Did you find the leak on the primary bulkhead?" Marcus froze, his face turning chalk white in the yellow glare of his lamp. He reached down with a shaking hand and unclipped his radio microphone. "Tommy?" He called into the mouthpiece, his voice cracking with panic. "Tommy, is that you? We've got a breach down here. The main bulkhead is destroyed, and the brine is gone." "Send the hoist cage back down immediately." There was a 3-second pause on the line, filled with the strange, rhythmic clicking sound of metal tapping against stone. Then the voice came back over the speaker. "Marcus, you need to step through the hole in the wall, Marcus. The company needs you to check the pressure gauge on the lower shuttle car." "It's just a routine maintenance check, Marcus." I grabbed the radio out of Marcus's hand and clicked the talk button. "Tommy, this is Eli. Switch the radio to channel 4. Who is on this line with you?" The radio didn't answer with words. It let out a high, vibrating screech that sounded like live steam escaping a rusty iron valve, mixed with the sound of 100 human voices screaming in unison from a great distance. Then, from deep inside the black fissure behind the salt-encrusted shuttle car, we heard the sound. Not through the radio, through the open air of the cavern. Tink, 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 tink. 3 slow, deliberate taps of iron striking rock salt. Then, 5 seconds of silence. Then 3 more taps, the universal subterranean distress signal. Out from the black void of the fissure, stepping fluidly across the dry salt slope toward the shuttle car, came the thing that lived beneath the dome. It was nearly 8 feet tall, built with a long, thin, jointed torso that resembled a skinless human ribcage, supported by 4 jointed limbs that moved with terrifying, fluid speed across the jagged salt rocks. Its body was hairless, slick, and pale white, caked in thick crusts of dried salt, wet river mud, and long trailing strands of dark grease. It had no eyes, no nose, no ears, just a smooth, featureless white skull that tapered into a wide horizontal slit running from ear to ear. As it stepped into the glare of our halogen lamps, that horizontal slit split open 4 inches wide. Inside was a dark, wet maw lined with 3 rows of long, needle-sharp teeth that fluttered, clicked, and vibrated against each other like the blades of a high-speed shears. And held tight in its pale, 6-fingered right hand was a heavy iron drill bit from 1968, which it raised and tapped 3 times against the steel bumper of the shuttle car. Tink, tink, tink. It raised its eyeless head toward the bulkhead opening where Marcus and I were standing, its needle teeth vibrating rapidly as it let out a sound that shook the concrete floor beneath our boots, a deep, vibrating howl that mimicked the exact voice of Tommy from the surface building, distorted into a demonic, echoing screech. "Marcus. Step down into the pit, Marcus." "Run!" I screamed, shoving Marcus backward toward the gallery tunnel with all my strength. "Get to the cage!" Pant. We turned on our heels and sprinted down the narrow, dark gallery toward the main vertical shaft, 500 yards away. Our boots slammed against the dry salt floor, our breath coming in wild, panicked gasps inside our wool face masks. Behind us, over the sound of our own footsteps, we heard the wet, heavy times, thump, thump, thump times of its jointed limbs launching the creature out of the breach, followed by the screech of its horn claws dragging across the concrete bulkhead as it entered the tunnel behind us. It was moving through the gallery with unbelievable speed, tracking us by the noise of our boots and the heat of our lungs in the dry salt air. The halogen light from my flashlight bounced wildly against the white walls as I ran, illuminating the dark tunnel ahead. We reached the vertical shaft clearing, threw ourselves into the open steel inspection cage, and Marcus grabbed the emergency winch signal cable, yanking it upward 3 times with frantic, desperate strength. "Pull US up. Pull US up now," he screamed toward the black opening of the shaft above. The heavy steel cable groaned. The overhead winch engine roared to life 2,000 feet above, and the inspection cage gave a violent jerk, lifting off the salt floor and descending into the dark vertical shaft just as the white creature burst out of the gallery tunnel below us. Through the wire mesh floor of the ascending cage, I shined my halogen beam straight down into the shaft. The creature didn't stop at the entrance of the gallery. It threw its long, jointed limbs onto the vertical iron rungs embedded in the salt wall of the shaft, climbing up the vertical rock face right behind our cage with the fluid speed of a giant spider. Its eyeless white skull was tilted upward, its wide, needle-filled mouth split open, calling out my name in my own mother's voice, a voice she had spoken with 30 years before she died. "Eli, stop the cage, Eli. It's warm down here." "No!" I screamed, grabbing the heavy iron lining bar from the floor of the cage and thrusting it downward through the bottom wire mesh with every ounce of strength I had left. The chisel tip of the iron bar struck the creature dead center in its eyeless skull as it reached for the bottom edge of the cage. A thick spray of black, oily fluid exploded out of the wound, stinging my hands like boiling battery acid. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek of rage, lost its grip on the iron rungs, and plummeted 700 feet back down into the pitch-black void at the bottom of the main shaft, crashing hard against the salt floor with a dull, distant thud. The 7-minute ascent to the surface was the longest wait of my life. We lay on the steel floor of the cage in total darkness, holding our breath, listening to the heavy winch cable hauling us upward into the cool air of the upper world. When the cage finally cleared the surface rim and locked into the hoist house, Marcus and I scrambled out onto the concrete floor, weeping, gasping for the night air. The federal authorities sealed the Iberia Parish salt facility 3 days later. They told the local news stations that a major water inflow disaster had destabilized the entire salt dome, making further storage operations impossible. They brought in 12 heavy concrete transport trucks, drove them to the top of the main shaft, and poured 800 yards of quick-setting quicklime slurry straight down the 2,000-foot hole, burying Cavern 12, the inspection shaft, and the creature beneath a solid block of concrete. I resigned from the Strategic Reserve the following week. I sold my house in Louisiana, packed my truck, and moved 1,200 miles north to a small, dry farming community in the sandhills of Nebraska, a place where there are no mines, no salt domes, no subterranean vaults, and where the nearest bedrock is buried beneath 300 feet of solid topsoil. That was 32 years ago. I am 74 years old now, living alone in a small white frame house built on a flat grass plain. I haven't stepped inside a basement or looked at an open hole in the ground since 1994. But 3 nights ago, during a heavy autumn thunderstorm, the electric water softener unit in my utility room began to recycle its internal brine tank. The machine brought up 3 gallons of saturated salt water from the storage tub to clean its filters. I was lying in bed in the dark when I heard the sound coming through the floorboards. Tink, tink, tink. A slow, deliberate tapping from inside the plastic salt tank, followed by a soft, mechanical voice coming up through the floor vents, speaking in Tommy's exact voice from 30 years ago. "Eli, is that you up there, Eli? We need you to check the valve.